It began with something that wasn't supposed to happen. At 20:17 a.m., the street outside Alder Creek Apartments was completely still, the kind of silence that usually goes unnoticed, buried beneath the distant hum of traffic or the occasional passing car. But that night, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, no indication that anything was about to break the pattern of normalcy that had defined that place for years. Ethan Caldwell had been inside his apartment for hours. The last confirmed activity came from his laptop, which logged a routine shutdown at exactly 14:52 a.m. There was nothing unusual about it. No late-night messages, no distress signals, no irregular behavior. Everything aligned perfectly with the kind of quiet, predictable life he was known for. And then, without any warning, something changed. At 20:17 a.m., a security camera positioned across the parking lot captured Ethan stepping out of his apartment building. The footage was clear. There was no distortion, no visual interference, nothing that could suggest malfunction. He walked at a normal pace, his posture relaxed, his movements unhurried. There was no sign of urgency, no indication that anything was wrong. He reached the center of the frame, and then he was gone. Not in a way people usually disappear. There was no sudden blur, no obstruction passing in front of the camera, no cut in the footage. One frame showed him mid-step, his foot just above the ground. The next frame showed nothing. The space he had occupied less than a second ago was now empty. The recording did not stop. The camera continued capturing the same empty parking lot for the next 6 hours. No one entered. No one exited. There were no vehicles, no shadows, no changes in lighting that could explain what had happened. It was as if Ethan Caldwell had simply ceased to exist in that exact moment, leaving behind no trace of movement, no direction, no continuation. When the footage was first reviewed, it was dismissed as a technical error. A glitch, possibly a frame skip, something explainable within the limitations of digital recording systems. But that explanation didn't hold for long. Because when the footage was slowed down, frame by frame, the sequence remained intact. There were no missing frames, no distortion, no visual anomalies. Every second was accounted for. Every frame transitioned exactly as it should have. And yet, within that continuous, uninterrupted sequence, a person disappeared without any visible cause. By 8:40 a.m., when Ethan failed to show up for work, the concern was minimal. He wasn't known for being unreliable, but a missed morning wasn't enough to trigger immediate alarm. It wasn't until his phone went straight to voicemail repeatedly that something began to feel off. By noon, a welfare check was requested. The responding officers found his apartment exactly as he had left it. The bed was unmade. A glass of water sat on the nightstand, half full. His wallet and keys were still inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of a struggle, nothing that suggested he had left in a hurry or under pressure. Everything pointed to a simple fact. Ethan Caldwell had walked out of his apartment in the middle of the night. And he had never come back. That the security footage should have provided clarity. Instead, it created a problem that no one was prepared to solve. Because it didn't just show a disappearance. It showed an impossibility. There were no blind spots in the camera's coverage. The angle captured the entire pathway between the building entrance and the parking lot exit. If Ethan had continued walking, he would have remained in frame for at least another 4 seconds. If he had turned around, that movement would have been visible. If anyone else had been present, their presence would have been recorded. But none of that happened. There was only one entry, and no exit. As the footage circulated among investigators, the initial confidence began to erode. What started as a routine missing persons case slowly shifted into something else, something harder to define. The kind of case that resists explanation, not because of missing information, but because of the information that does exist. Because everything about the footage was too complete, too precise, too undeniable. And that was the problem. There were no gaps to question, no inconsistencies to challenge, no external factors to introduce doubt. The evidence didn't suggest confusion. It suggested clarity, a level of clarity that made the event itself more difficult to process. Ethan Caldwell didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't leave. He simply reached a point in space and was no longer there. By the time the case was officially opened, it had already begun to separate itself from anything investigators had encountered before. Not because it lacked evidence, but because the evidence refused to behave in a way that made sense. And as more attention was directed to Warren, that single moment, the exact frame where Ethan Caldwell disappeared, another detail began to surface. It wasn't something obvious. It wasn't something anyone noticed at first. But once it was seen, it couldn't be ignored. Because the most unsettling part of the footage wasn't that Ethan disappeared. It was what appeared in the frame immediately after. For Ethan Caldwell, nothing about that day suggested it would be his last. He woke up at 7:08 a.m., just a few minutes before his alarm was set to go off. It was a habit he had developed over the years, his internal rhythm more reliable than any device. The morning followed a pattern so consistent that it almost felt automatic. Coffee brewed at the same time, the same news podcast played in the background, and his phone remained untouched until he was fully awake. There was no urgency in his routine, no deviation that could hint at disruption. Ethan worked as a data analyst for a mid-sized logistics firm based in Denver. His role required precision, attention to detail, and long hours of quiet concentration. It suited him. He wasn't withdrawn, but he preferred structure over unpredictability. People who knew him often described him as steady. Not particularly expressive, but dependable in a way that didn't draw attention. That morning, he left his apartment at 8:26 a.m. The building's entry camera captured him the same way it always did. Walking at a measured pace, dressed in neutral tones, his posture relaxed but purposeful. There was nothing unusual in his expression. No hesitation, no distraction. Just another ordinary start to an ordinary day. His commute took exactly 17 minutes. At 8:43 a.m., his office keycard registered his arrival. By 9:00 a.m., he was already at his desk, reviewing a set of shipment discrepancies flagged overnight. The work required focus, but it wasn't overwhelming. His system logs later showed continuous activity throughout the morning, data inputs, minor corrections, a few internal emails. All routine, all expected. At 11:12 a.m., he stepped out for coffee. The cafe across the street was part of his daily rhythm. He ordered the same drink every time, rarely deviating, rarely lingering. That day was no different. The transaction receipt confirmed the purchase. The barista later recalled nothing unusual about the interaction. No signs of stress, no visible distraction. Just another customer moving through a familiar routine. By early afternoon, the day had settled into its usual pace. At 20:35 p.m., Ethan attended a brief team meeting. Notes from the session indicated that he contributed where necessary, offering clear and concise input. Nothing stood out. No one remembered anything unusual about his tone or behavior. If anything, he seemed exactly as he always, focused, composed, and quietly present. At 5:18 p.m., he logged out. The system recorded a clean exit. No unfinished tasks, no irregularities in his workflow. He packed his belongings, left his desk as he always did, and exited the building at 5:26 p.m. The security footage showed the same consistent movement, the same steady pace. Everything aligned, everything made sense. By 5:44 p.m., he was back at Alder Creek Apartments. A neighbor, Daniel Reeves, passed him briefly in the hallway. It wasn't a conversation, just a subtle acknowledgement, something routine, almost forgettable. Later, when asked, Daniel would struggle to recall anything specific about that moment. There was nothing to remember, no detail that stood out, because nothing about Ethan Caldwell on that day demanded attention. Inside his apartment, the pattern continued. At 6:10 p.m., his smart speaker activated a pre-saved playlist. A mix of instrumental tracks, low volume, consistent with his usual evening routine. Around the same time, his kitchen light switched on. Power usage logs showed minor fluctuations, appliances used briefly, then turned off. There was movement, but nothing irregular. At 7:02 p.m., he ordered takeout. The receipt confirmed the time. Delivery was completed at 7:29 p.m. The driver later described the interaction as brief and uneventful. Ethan opened the door, accepted the order, and closed it without hesitation. No signs of concern. No unusual behavior. By 8:15 p.m., the apartment had gone quiet. No outgoing calls. No incoming messages. No digital activity beyond passive usage. It wasn't unusual for Ethan to disconnect in the evenings. He valued that silence. It was part of his routine, a way to reset before the next day began. There was comfort in that predictability, a sense of control that defined how he lived. At 4:47 p.m., his bedroom light turned off. From that point forward, the apartment remained inactive. No movement sensors triggered. No doors opened. No sound detected. For nearly 3 hours, everything remained exactly as it should have been. Stable. Uninterrupted. Normal, and that was the problem. Because when the timeline was later reconstructed, investigators found no cracks in that day. No unusual calls, no behavioral shifts, no external pressures that could explain what happened next. Every hour, every action, every recorded detail pointed toward a life that was functioning exactly as expected. There were no warning signs, no escalation, no visible reason for anything to go wrong, which meant that whatever happened at 17 a.m. did not begin that night. It didn't emerge from chaos. It didn't follow disruption. It came from something else entirely, something that had already been in place long before anyone thought to look for it. And as investigators began revisiting the events of that day, searching for anything they might have missed, one detail started to stand out. Not because it was obvious, but because it didn't belong. A detail so subtle, it had blended perfectly into the routine. Until it didn't, because by the time Ethan Caldwell stepped out of his apartment that night, that detail had already changed everything. By the time investigators isolated the exact moment Ethan Caldwell disappeared, the timeline had already been reconstructed down to the second. What made this case different wasn't the lack of information. It was the precision of it. At 20:13 a.m., the hallway camera inside Alder Creek Apartments recorded Ethan's door opening. The motion was smooth, unforced, consistent with someone leaving by choice rather than under pressure. He stepped into the hallway without hesitation, closing the door behind him with the same controlled movement seen in every previous recording of his routine. There was no urgency in his pace, no sign of distress, no indication that anything about this moment was different from any other. He walked toward the elevator, his posture upright, his gaze forward. The lighting in the hallway remained constant, no flickering, no interference. Every frame captured him clearly, each movement uninterrupted. At 20:14 a.m., the elevator door opened. He stepped inside. For 12 seconds, there was no visual. Then, at 20:12 a.m., the ground floor camera picked him up again as the elevator doors slid open. The transition was seamless. No delay, no missing time. Ethan stepped out and turned toward the main exit. At 20:15 a.m., the lobby camera recorded him crossing the floor. The same steady pace, the same neutral expression. Nothing about his body language suggested confusion or hesitation. If anything, he appeared focused, as if he already knew exactly where he was going. But there was no record of where that was. At 20:16 a.m., he exited the building. The exterior camera activated as expected, adjusting to the low light conditions without distortion. The image remained sharp. The parking lot stretched across the frame, empty and still. No vehicles moving, no people nearby, nothing that could interfere with visibility. Ethan entered the frame from the left side. For a brief moment, everything aligned perfectly. His movement matched the internal timeline. The camera captured him from a clear angle. There were no obstructions, no shadows crossing his path, no technical anomalies. At 20:32 a.m., he reached the midpoint of the parking lot. And then, something began to shift. Not in a way that could be immediately identified, but in a way that became undeniable once the footage was reviewed repeatedly. His final steps did not follow a natural rhythm. Frame analysis later showed that his stride, while appearing normal at first glance, altered slightly in its final sequence. The distance between steps remained consistent, but the timing between frames introduced a subtle irregularity. Not enough to suggest malfunction, not enough to confirm interference, just enough to raise doubt. At 20:07 a.m., 00:03 a.m. Ethan Caldwell took one final step forward. His right foot lifted, his body leaned into motion, and in the very next frame, he was gone. No transition, no visual distortion, no environmental reaction. The space he occupied remained unchanged, as if nothing had ever been there. The camera continued recording. The parking lot remained still. Nothing entered. Nothing exited. For the next 6 hours, the frame showed the same empty scene, uninterrupted and consistent. When the footage was first processed, the assumption was immediate and logical: a dropped frame, a compression error, or a data skip during recording. These were standard explanations, common in digital surveillance systems. But this system had no record of failure, no flagged errors, no corrupted files. Every frame was present, every timestamp aligned. When the footage was slowed down to its lowest possible speed, the sequence remained intact. Frame by frame, the transition was complete. There was no gap in recording, no visual break that could explain the disappearance. Ethan Caldwell did not move out of frame. He did not accelerate. He did not change direction. He did not fall. He did not reappear. He simply ceased to occupy space within a continuous, uninterrupted recording. Investigators attempted to reconstruct alternative explanations. They examined the possibility of blind spots, but the camera coverage overlapped with a secondary angle positioned near the entrance gate. That camera, too, showed no movement. No continuation. They analyzed lighting conditions, searching for distortions or shadow interference that could obscure motion. But the lighting remained stable, casting consistent shadows that did not shift or distort during the moment in question. They reviewed environmental factors, wind, temperature, any external variable that could influence visibility. Nothing changed. Everything remained controlled. And that was the problem. Because the more stable the environment appeared, the less room there was for error. And without error, there was no explanation. By 30:10 a.m., the footage had already been flagged internally. By 6:45 a.m., it had been reviewed by multiple technicians. By 9:30 a.m., the classification of the case began to shift. This was no longer a standard disappearance. It wasn't even an anomaly in the traditional sense, because anomalies suggest deviation. This did not deviate. It followed every rule of the system it existed within, except for one. And that single exception was enough to break everything. As investigators continued to isolate the exact frame, the moment where Ethan Caldwell was present, and then wasn't, another detail began to emerge. Not within the timeline, not within the environment, but within Ethan himself. Because in that final sequence, just before he disappeared, something about his movement didn't just seem irregular. It seemed intentional. By the time the case was formally assigned, the evidence had already begun to create resistance. What should have been a structured investigation, methodical, predictable, grounded in procedure, started to unravel the moment it relied too heavily on what the footage appeared to show. Because every standard approach depended on one assumption: that events followed a logical sequence. In this case, they didn't. Detective Marcus Harlan was assigned to lead the investigation within the first 24 hours. His background was built on pattern recognition, missing persons, and behavioral reconstruction. Cases rarely surprised him. Most disappearances, no matter how complex they initially appeared, eventually revealed a traceable path: financial activity, communication patterns, physical movement. But this case offered none of that. Ethan Caldwell's digital footprint ended at 1:52 a.m. His physical movement, as confirmed by surveillance, ended at 20:17 a.m. Between those 2 points, everything aligned with expectation. After that, nothing existed. The first phase of the investigation focused on proximity. Search teams covered the immediate area surrounding Alder Creek Apartments within a 6-mile radius. Thermal drones were deployed during early morning hours, scanning for any heat signatures that could suggest disorientation, injury, or concealment. Ground units followed grid patterns, revisiting locations multiple times to eliminate oversight. Nothing was found: no clothing, no personal items, and no signs of disturbance in the surrounding terrain. Even areas that typically retain evidence, soft soil, gravel paths, drainage zones, showed no indication that anyone had passed through them during that time window. The assumption shifted. If Ethan hadn't left the area on foot, then he must have entered a vehicle. Traffic cameras within a 3-mile perimeter were pulled and reviewed. License plates were logged, timestamps cross-referenced. Every vehicle that passed through the area between 10 a.m. and 20:30 a.m. was identified and tracked. None of them matched. There was no vehicle stopping near the apartment complex. No delayed movement. No irregular driving patterns. The roads remained as empty as the parking lot. By the second day, the investigation expanded beyond physical search. Financial records were examined. Bank activity remained unchanged. No withdrawals. No unusual transactions. His credit cards were inactive. Phone records showed no outgoing communication after 8:15 p.m. the previous night. Location data placed his device inside the apartment until it powered down, exactly as expected. There was no evidence of a second device, no hidden accounts, no alternate identity. Everything about Ethan Caldwell's life suggested stability. No debt, no conflict, no reason to leave, which introduced a problem investigators are rarely prepared to face. There was no motive. By the third day, interviews began to lose value. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. No sounds during the night, no unfamiliar faces, no disturbances that could indicate forced entry or external involvement. Ethan's coworkers described him as consistent, reserved, predictable. No recent behavioral changes. No signs of stress or withdrawal. There was nothing to extract. No tension to follow. No narrative to build. The case had structure but no direction. And without direction, the investigation began to stall. Detective Harlan shifted focus back to the footage. If the environment offered no answers, then the anomaly itself had to be re-examined. Frame analysis was conducted across multiple labs, each using different processing systems to identify potential inconsistencies. Compression artifacts, frame interpolation, signal interference, every known technical variable was tested. The results remained unchanged. The footage was clean. Too clean. Which led to a quiet but critical shift in internal discussion. Not all investigators agreed, but the question began to surface. What if the footage wasn't hiding something? What if it was showing exactly what happened? That possibility wasn't documented. It wasn't included in official reports, but it influenced how certain details were approached moving forward. Because if the footage was accurate, if there was no missing data, no distortion, then the disappearance wasn't a failure of observation. It was a failure of understanding. By the end of the first week, the case was reclassified. Not closed, but contained. The search radius was reduced. Active field operations were scaled back. Resources were reassigned. On paper, the case remained open. In practice, it had reached a limit. Detective Harlan continued working it, but the nature of his work changed. It was no longer about finding Ethan Caldwell. It was about identifying anything that could reintroduce logic into a situation that refused to follow it. And that's when the detail surfaced. It didn't come from new evidence. It didn't emerge from advanced analysis. It came from something already seen, something already recorded, something that had been overlooked, not because it was hidden, but because it didn't seem important at the time. A detail so minor, it had passed through every layer of review without resistance, until someone noticed that it didn't belong. Because when that detail was isolated, it didn't just raise questions about what happened at 17 a.m. It raised questions about everything that happened before it. It wasn't the disappearance that changed the direction of the case. It was something far smaller. Something that had been present from the beginning, recorded clearly, processed repeatedly, and then dismissed without resistance. Not because it lacked visibility, but because it appeared too ordinary to question. In a case defined by an impossible moment, attention had naturally gravitated toward the event itself, the exact frame where Ethan Caldwell vanished. Everything else became secondary. And that was the mistake. The details surfaced during a secondary review of the exterior footage, nearly 6 days after the investigation began to slow down. The purpose of the review wasn't to find something new. It was to confirm that nothing had been missed. A procedural step, routine, expected to produce nothing. But when the footage was slowed down again, this time not to analyze the disappearance, but to examine the seconds leading up to it, something shifted. Ethan's movement, while consistent in direction, wasn't consistent in behavior. At first glance, his walk appeared normal. The same measured pace, the same controlled posture seen throughout the earlier recordings. But as the frames were isolated and aligned side by side, a subtle inconsistency began to form. Not in where he was going, but in how he was moving. Specifically, his right hand. For the first 2 seconds after entering the parking lot frame, his arms followed a natural swing pattern, balanced, unforced, matching his stride. But at 20:35 a.m. that pattern changed. His right hand stopped moving. It didn't freeze abruptly. It didn't jerk or hesitate. It simply settled. The motion that had been present just moments earlier disappeared, replaced by a stillness that didn't align with the rest of his body. His left arm continued its natural rhythm, but the right remained slightly rigid, positioned just inches away from his side. At full speed, the change was almost impossible to detect. But frame by frame, it became undeniable. It wasn't just still, it was controlled, as if the movement had been intentionally reduced. The initial interpretation was simply muscle tension, a minor physical adjustment, something natural and insignificant. But when compared against earlier footage, dozens of recordings showing him walking in similar conditions, the pattern didn't match. There had never been asymmetry in his movement before. Not once. Which meant this wasn't habitual. It was specific to that moment. The analysis extended further. Zoom enhancement was applied to isolate the position of his hand. Resolution limitations prevented absolute clarity, but the outline remained visible enough to identify one critical detail. His fingers weren't relaxed. They were slightly curled inward. Not clenched. Not gripping, but positioned in a way that suggested contact with something or anticipation of it. There was no object visible. Nothing in his hand. Nothing in the surrounding space. But the positioning didn't align with empty motion. It aligned with intent. That detail alone wasn't enough to redefine the case. But it created pressure, because once it was identified, it began to influence everything around it. Investigators revisited the internal footage. The hallway camera, the elevator sequence, the lobby transition. Each segment was re-examined not for anomalies in the environment, but for consistency in Ethan's movement. And the same pattern appeared. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but present. His right hand, while not completely still, showed reduced motion throughout the entire sequence after he left his apartment. Not enough to stand out under normal review. Not enough to trigger suspicion, but enough to suggest that whatever had affected that movement had started before he reached the parking lot. Which introduced a new variable. The change didn't happen at 20:17 a.m. It had already begun, quietly, without disruption, without drawing attention, and that meant the disappearance wasn't the first anomaly. It was the final one. By the time this detail was documented, the case had already begun to cool. Resources had been reduced. Active search operations had slowed. But this single inconsistency forced a reconsideration, not of where Ethan had gone, but of what had been happening before he disappeared. Because controlled movement implies awareness, and awareness implies intent. But intent requires a direction. And in this case, there was none. Ethan Caldwell wasn't moving toward an exit. He wasn't reacting to a threat. He wasn't following a visible path. He was walking into something that didn't exist within the frame. And whatever that was, he seemed to recognize it before anyone else did. As the footage continued to be analyzed, one conclusion became harder to ignore. This wasn't a random breakdown in reality. It wasn't an environmental failure. It wasn't even a spontaneous event, because if the change in his movement had started earlier, then whatever caused it had already been there, waiting. Unseen. And by the time Ethan reached the center of that parking lot, he wasn't just walking through it. He was stepping directly into it. It didn't begin with Ethan Caldwell. That realization didn't come from a breakthrough or a single discovery. It emerged slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the case itself resisted expansion. For days, everything had been contained within the boundaries of one event, one location, one individual. The assumption was simply this was an isolated anomaly. But isolation requires uniqueness, and this case was no longer unique. The first connection came from a database that wasn't designed to find patterns like this. It was a regional archive of unresolved cases, missing persons, unexplained disappearances, incidents that had failed to reach conclusion. Thousands of entries, most of them unrelated, most of them explainable under closer scrutiny. Detective Marcus Harlan didn't expect to find anything. He wasn't searching for identical cases. That would have been unrealistic. No two incidents align perfectly, especially in situations where information is incomplete. Instead, he searched for fragments, partial overlaps, small consistencies that might suggest a shared structure. At first, nothing stood out. Then, a timestamp appeared. Case file Daniel Harper. Missing 3 years earlier. Portland, Oregon. The details were limited. A late-night disappearance. Last seen exiting his apartment building. No signs of struggle. No evidence of departure. The case had gone cold within weeks. It wasn't the story that caught Harlan's attention. It was the footage. A request was filed. Archived surveillance was retrieved. The quality was lower, the system older, but the sequence remained intact. Daniel Harper exiting the building, crossing a dimly lit exterior space, moving at a normal pace. And then, the same break. Not identical, not perfectly aligned, but structurally similar. One frame present. Next frame gone. No transition, no continuation. The explanation at the time had been technical failure, a recording gap, attributed to system limitations. The case had been processed accordingly, the anomaly dismissed as equipment error. But now, that explanation no longer held. Because Ethan Caldwell's footage had no error, which meant Daniel Harper's case might have been misunderstood. The search widened. Not geographically, but structurally. Harlan began filtering cases based on specific criteria. Late-night movement. Last confirmed sighting on camera. No physical evidence of exit. No recovery of remains. The list narrowed, then expanded again. Another case surfaced, Lena Whitaker missing. 7 years earlier, Austin, Texas. The details followed a familiar pattern. Routine day. No signs of distress. Last seen leaving a residential complex shortly after midnight. Surveillance footage partially available. The sequence was incomplete, but what remained showed enough. Her movement appeared normal. Until it didn't. The final seconds of footage showed a disruption, not visual, not environmental, but temporal. A shift in continuity that couldn't be fully explained. At the time, it had been attributed to data corruption. Now it aligned too closely to ignore. By the fourth case, the pattern stopped being theoretical. It became structural. Different cities, different individuals, different EULs, but the same underlying sequence. A normal day, a controlled exit, a final recorded movement. And then, nothing. No continuation, no resolution, no trace. Each case had been investigated independently. Each had reached the same conclusion: insufficient evidence. No foul play confirmed. No explanation established. But none of them had been compared. Not like this. Not through the lens of pattern recognition. Because patterns require repetition. And repetition requires acknowledgement. By the time the fifth case was identified, the timeline introduced something even more unsettling. The intervals weren't random. They were spaced. Not evenly. Not predictably. But deliberately enough to suggest structure. 3 years. Then 4. Then 2. Then 3 again. Not a cycle. But not chaos either. Something in between. Something controlled. And within each case, a smaller detail began to repeat. Not in the environment. Not in the footage quality. But in the subject. Past subtle behavioral inconsistencies in the moments before disappearance. Minor deviations in movement. A shift in posture. A change in rhythm that had gone unnoticed because it didn't appear significant at the time. Just like Ethan Caldwell's hand. By the time this pattern was documented, the case had already moved beyond standard classification. This was no longer a missing persons investigation. It wasn't even a series of anomalies. It was a sequence. A system that operated without visibility, without interaction, without leaving behind anything that could be measured or tracked. And that raised a question no one could answer. If this had happened before, and no one had noticed, then how many times had it happened without being recorded at all? Because every confirmed case depended on one factor: a camera, a fixed point of observation, a moment captured just long enough to reveal the break. But what about the moments that weren't captured? The places without surveillance, the disappearances without witnesses, the events that left behind no frame to analyze. Those wouldn't appear in any database. They wouldn't form patterns. They wouldn't exist, at least not in any way that could be proven. Which meant the pattern they had found might not be the full pattern. It might only be the visible part of something much larger. And if that was true, then Case 547 wasn't just another entry in a sequence. It was the first time the sequence had been seen clearly enough to be recognized. Because for the first time, the footage didn't fail. The system didn't glitch. The moment didn't disappear. It remained intact. And what it revealed wasn't just a pattern of disappearances. It revealed a process. Something that didn't interrupt reality. Something that operated within it. Quietly, precisely. And by the time anyone noticed, it was already happening again. By the time the pattern was established, the case had reached a point where explanation became unavoidable. Not because the answers were clear, but because the absence of an answer had become too structured to ignore. Investigators, analysts, and independent reviewers began approaching the case from different angles, each attempting to impose logic onto something that resisted it. Theories emerged quickly. At first, they followed predictable paths. The most immediate explanation was technical. If multiple cases showed similar disappearances tied to surveillance footage, then the issue had to originate within the systems themselves. Frame loss, compression artifacts, synchronization errors, these were all known limitations, especially in older recording systems. Even modern cameras, under specific conditions, could produce inconsistencies that appeared seamless under normal playback. On the surface, it worked. Daniel Harper's case could be explained this way. The older system, the lower resolution, the documented gaps. Lena Whittaker's footage, partially corrupted, aligned with the same possibility. These cases fit within the boundaries of technical failure. But Ethan Caldwell didn't. His footage had been verified across multiple systems. Frame integrity was intact. No drop data, no compression anomalies. The timestamps aligned perfectly. Every second was accounted for, which meant the technical theory could explain the past, but not the present. And without consistency, it failed. The second theory shifted toward human behavior, voluntary disappearance. It suggested that individuals like Ethan Caldwell had chosen to leave, constructing controlled exits that appeared unnatural due to limited perspective. The idea wasn't new. People disappeared by choice more often than expected, leaving behind carefully managed traces or none at all. But this required one condition: continuity. There had to be a path beyond the frame, a direction, a follow-up movement that existed outside the camera's view. In these cases, there wasn't. No extended footage, no secondary sightings, no financial activities, no digital trace. The disappearances didn't continue. They ended. Completely. Which meant voluntary action couldn't sustain itself beyond the moment of disappearance. It explained intent, but not outcome. The third theory moved into environmental territory. Localized spatial distortion. Not in the abstract sense, but in measurable terms, areas where perception, light, or physical continuity could be altered under specific conditions. Certain natural phenomena had been known to affect visibility, distort movement, or create temporary blind zones within camera systems. Again, it worked, partially. It introduced the idea that something external could interfere with observation. That under precise conditions, a person could move through a space without being fully captured. But the consistency of the footage challenged that. Lighting remained stable. Shadows behaved normally. No distortion affected surrounding objects. Only the subject was impacted, which meant the environment wasn't changing. The subject was. And that shifted the focus again. A fourth theory began to form, not officially, not documented in reports, but present in internal discussions. Behavioral synchronization. The idea that the individuals involved weren't reacting to something visible, but to something perceived. A stimulus that didn't register on camera, but influenced movement in a measurable way. This aligned with the subtle behavioral changes observed before each disappearance. The shift in posture, the controlled movement, the reduced variability in motion. It suggested awareness, not of danger, but of direction, as if each individual, in their final moments, was aligning themselves with something that couldn't be seen, but could be followed. This theory didn't require environmental distortion. It didn't depend on technical failure. It operated within the subject, but it introduced a problem no one could resolve. If the stimulus wasn't visible, then what was guiding them? And how was it consistent across different individuals, different locations, different years? No known mechanism could explain that level of precision. No known system could produce that kind of response without leaving a trace. Which meant even this theory, more aligned than the others, remained incomplete. Every explanation reached the same point, a threshold where logic stopped extending. Not abruptly, but consistently. Each theory approached the event from a different direction, built structure, introduced reasoning, and then collapsed under the same weight, the final moment, because none of them could explain what happened at 20:17 a.m. Not in a way that matched the evidence, not in a way that preserved continuity, not in a way that accounted for the absence of everything that should have followed. And that was the pattern, not just in the cases, but in the explanations themselves. They worked, until they didn't. By the time these theories had been reviewed, debated, and internally dismissed, the case had reached a point where explanation was no longer the objective. Understanding was. Because whatever this was, it wasn't breaking the rules. It was following a set of rules that hadn't been identified yet. And those rules didn't just apply to Ethan Caldwell. They applied to every case in the pattern, which meant the answer wasn't missing. It was incomplete, hidden within something that had already been seen, but not recognized for what it was. Because in every case, that there was one element that remained constant, not the location, not the time, not the individual, but the moment. That exact point where presence became absence, where movement stopped without interruption, where continuity ended without transition. And if that moment could be understood, that then everything else might start to make sense. But there was one final piece of the case that hadn't been fully examined. Not because it was hidden, but because it didn't seem important until everything else failed. And once that piece was placed back into the sequence, it didn't just challenge the theories, it erased them. In the end, it wasn't a new discovery that changed the case. It was something that had been there from the beginning, unmoved, unquestioned, and almost completely ignored. After the theories collapsed and the pattern stabilized, Detective Marcus Harlan returned to the footage one final time, not to analyze the disappearance, not to track Ethan's movement, but to observe the frame itself, the environment, the details that existed independently of the subject. Because everything so far had focused on Ethan Caldwell, and nothing had explained what he was interacting with. The frame at 21:03 a.m. was isolated again. Ethan mid-step, body in forward motion. And then the next frame, empty. At first glance, nothing had changed. The same still parking lot, the same fixed lighting, the same static environment. But when the two frames were layered and compared, not for movement, but for difference, a subtle inconsistency appeared. Not where Ethan had been, but just ahead of him, approximately 3 feet in front of his final position. It wasn't visible in the traditional sense. There was no object, no defined shape, no shadow that shouldn't be there. But the pixels in that specific area behaved differently. Not dramatically, not enough to be noticed during normal playback. But under layered comparison, their values shifted in a way that didn't align with the rest of the frame. A minor distortion, localized, stable, and present in both frames, which meant it hadn't appeared suddenly. It had already been there, before Ethan reached it. Before the final step, before the disappearance, the distortion didn't move. It didn't expand. It didn't react. It remained fixed in space, unaffected by anything around it. And for the first time, the sequence could be reinterpreted not as a disappearance, but as an interaction. Ethan Caldwell hadn't vanished randomly. He had reached a point, a precise location, and when he entered it, he was no longer visible. The implications shifted immediately. This wasn't an event triggered by time. It wasn't dependent on behavior. It wasn't something that followed Ethan. It was something that existed independently, and he walked into it. The earlier detail, the controlled movement of his hand, began to make sense within this new context. If that distortion had been present before he reached it, then his behavior wasn't random. It was aligned, not with something he could see clearly, but with something he could detect. Something that influenced his movement just enough to guide him toward it. Not forcefully, not urgently, but precisely. And that precision was the most unsettling part, because it implied that the interaction wasn't accidental. It wasn't a collision. It was an arrival. When the same analysis was applied retroactively to the other cases, the limitations of older footage made confirmation difficult. But in the few instances where resolution allowed for comparison, similar irregularities began to surface. Not identical, not as clear, but present enough to suggest consistency. A fixed point, a localized distortion, a place where continuity didn't behave as expected. And in every case, that the subject moved toward it, without hesitation, without resistance, which meant the pattern wasn't based on time intervals or geographic spread. It was based on placement. These points, whatever they were, existed in specific locations at specific times, remaining undetected until someone crossed into them. And the only reason they had been noticed now was because Ethan Caldwell's footage was clear enough to reveal it. The case was never unsolved. It was misinterpreted, because from the beginning, the focus had been on the wrong question. Where did Ethan go? That question assumed movement beyond the frame, assumed continuation, assumed that something had taken him away. But the footage didn't show removal. It showed transition, a shift from visible to non-visible, not disappearance, but displacement. And once that distinction was made, the entire structure of the case changed. Because if Ethan didn't leave the frame, then the frame itself was incomplete. It wasn't capturing everything that existed within that space. It was only capturing what could be seen, and whatever existed within that distortion wasn't part of that system. By the time this interpretation was formed, the case had already been archived. Officially, nothing had changed. No new evidence had been submitted. No conclusions had been revised. But internally, the understanding had shifted. Quietly. Permanently. Because once that fixed point was identified, it raised a question that couldn't be ignored. Not about Ethan. Not about the past cases. But about everything moving forward. If these points existed, undetected, unmeasured, and independent of observation, then how many of them were there? And more importantly, how often were people already walking toward them without ever being seen again? Because the most unsettling part of case File 47 wasn't that Ethan Caldwell disappeared. It was that he didn't disappear alone. He just happened to be the first one, captured clearly enough for anyone to notice. Case File 47 was never defined by the disappearance itself, but by the precision of how it happened. Every layer of investigation revealed structure, not chaos, suggesting that the event followed rules that simply weren't understood. The pattern, the behavior, and the final interaction all pointed towards something existing just beyond visible reality. What made this case different was not that it occurred, but that it was recorded clearly enough to be recognized. And once recognized, it became impossible to ignore. Because if one moment like this can exist without explanation, it raises the possibility that many more already have. The only difference is, this time someone was watching. This case made you question what we actually understand about reality. Then you're already seeing what most people overlook. Cases like this don't end, they just fade out of attention. And sometimes, the only difference between a mystery and the truth is who's paying attention. If you want more cases like this, where every detail matters and nothing is as simple as it looks, make sure you stay connected. Because the next case might not be less disturbing, it might just be clearer. And when that happens, you'll want to see it from the beginning.